Welcome to the Morning Formation. This episode is powered by Act Now Education. Go to www.actnoweducation.com for free comprehensive educational resources and opportunities for active duty, veterans, military spouses, and children. Warriors fall in. It's time for formation. It's been a while, but I'm very thankful today that I get an opportunity to sit with one of my good friends, John Jones. John has lived a very interesting life, starting out in the military and eventually transitioning into law enforcement. John, thank you for giving me your time today.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
John is a fascinating interview, and I wanted to bring him online today, mainly because he has a lot of experience in leadership and experiences both in the transition process between military and law enforcement. And I know a lot of folks today really struggle with understanding what they're getting into. So, John, if you wouldn't mind, early in up front, just go ahead and tell us exactly where you started and where you ended up in your career.
Sure. So, graduated high school a year early, ended up going in the Navy at 17. I was a hospital corpsman, so I was FMF, so I was a corpsman with the Marine Corps, deployed to Somalia with them. Was in for just under 7 years before being medically released and medically separated, which is not what I wanted to do, but ultimately ended up getting into civilian law enforcement, local law enforcement. I was a deputy sheriff for Douglas County in Nebraska, which is where Omaha is. Did that for about 5.5 years. Transitioned from there into federal law enforcement. Started off with the VA police, and then went into now that I'm retired, went from that into a highly sought after position that law enforcement with Homeland Security, and did that for about 14 years, and then was actually medically retired from that recently. So 2 careers that I wanted to pursue full time till for retirement ended up being medically retired from both. But, not letting that keep you down, ended up pivoting from that. And now I actually have a book coming out in support of law enforcement that'll be released Memorial Day weekend. And then I also went, and even though I can't physically do law enforcement anymore, I still want to help people. I don't want to fight people to do it. So I ended up transitioning and got my insurance license and financial rep. And so that's what I'm doing now. I'm trying to help law enforcement, local law enforcement, military, transitioning military understand the benefit of financial literacy early in life. The earlier you do it, the better off you're going to be.
Your whole life has been basically a big transition, man. You go from one thing to another thing.
One thing, another thing, another thing. Yeah. So
now, when you were in the Navy, you were a corpsman, right?
Yes.
Can you explain what that is?
So a corpsman is an enlisted medical provider, very similar to the medics in the Army and the Air Force and Coast Guard. You're providing medical services to military members and dependent family members. My very first assignment out of corpsman school was the Naval Hospital San Diego at Balboa, and I was assigned to a pediatrics clinic. So I was actually helping dependent kids with It was a clinic, so it wasn't, inpatient services. So anything very similar to like, bringing your kids to a pediatrician now. From there, I transferred to um, what they call FMF, the Fleet Marine Force. So that's a voluntary job. And then you transition from like a clinical setting to more, you were in the Army, so 68 Whiskey combat medic, right? That's very similar to that. So if you ever seen this movie Saving Private Ryan, the medic in that movie, or more recently, even though I was not in special warfare in any kind, American Sniper, when individuals were injured, traumatic medicine in combat. That's what I did.
Now, when you signed up for that, did you know what that was? Did you know what that MOS was?
I did. I was actually, I was a military nerd growing up. That's all. The very first time I walked into a recruiting office, I was 7 years old. Um,
7
and
years old.
I was 7 years old. So I grew up with a very significant military influence family. My dad was Special Operations Marine in the 50s. I
Hmm.
have an uncle who was Special Operations Marine in Vietnam. I have another uncle who did 27 years in the Navy. Another uncle, Air Force in Vietnam. So very heavily influenced
Hmm.
military. Both of my grandfathers were World War II veterans. My maternal grandfather, Bronze Star recipient from D-Day. So, you know, very heavily influenced military. But that's
Yeah.
why I wanted to go in the military. I wanted to do 20 years, wanted to retire from that. But to answer your question, I was in in a program that's very similar to like JROTC, but it was specifically with the Navy. It's called Sea Cadets. Within Sea Cadets, um, it's almost like a high school reserve program. You go one weekend a month, you do 2 week trainings during the summer, and you learn all of the customs and courtesies. But one of the things that you had access to was a lot of the job um, duties and assignments and responsibilities. So I got exposed to aviation jobs, shipboard jobs, the medical field, specialty jobs such as like air crew and submarine and those kind of jobs. So
Yeah, no, it sounds fascinating, man. You got exposed at a very early age. Now, when you transitioned out, did you know you wanted to be in law enforcement?
I actually I didn't know I wanted to be in law enforcement growing up. Again, one of my uncles, the Air Force vet from Vietnam, ended up doing 40 plus years in law enforcement. But I was raised in California. He was in Florida. And this was before the internet, so before social media and stuff. So the influence was there, just not on a daily basis. But when I transitioned out of the military, I had two kids, had been divorced, so that's why I ended up in Omaha. That's where my kids were, and I knew that I wanted to continue my service. Um, I knew that I wanted to do something that was going to help people and still provide a decent um, quality of life for my kids. So
Yeah.
it was either law enforcement, firefighting, um, some kind of civil service like that. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. And back then, to get into law enforcement, you had to actually wait in line. I mean, I remember
Yeah.
back in the 80s and 90s, to get into law enforcement, you had to apply, you had to try out, you had to compete. It was very competitive to get into it, unlike it is today. So, when you decided to transition from local to federal, why did you make that decision?
Mainly because there were things on the sheriff's department where I saw the future, my trajectory on the sheriff's department was going to be limited. Um, For instance, at that time, there was no SWAT teams, special reaction team on the sheriff's department at that time. There is now, ironically, but, so the way that I saw it, going federal, you could also buy back your military time. So your military time goes towards retirement. So that's when I started looking at the future and not just working and trying to get this next promotion or this next specialty position, but long term, what can I do that'll still do those things that will provide a good life and not have to work until, I saw some of the deputies that I worked with were 65 years old, still working in the courthouse, escorting inmates, to and from court, back from the courthouse to the jail, in their mid to late 60s. And that I did not want to be doing that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and you were no stranger to moving. So going national anywhere in the United States was comfortable for you versus like someone that was born and raised in a specific county in a specific state. So I could see why it would be easy for you to step outside your boundaries with that. And then throughout your entire career, in your opinion, what were the best type of key leadership qualities that you found to be most effective in both the military and law enforcement? Because a lot of times people who've never been in the military but are law enforcement, a lot of times they'll say, well, this isn't the military. But I know that a lot of times those same qualities can be transitioned over to the law enforcement side. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, for sure. For sure. So those qualities that serve you well in the military, that will serve you well in law enforcement, civilian law enforcement, discipline, in your physical fitness, discipline in your education, discipline in knowing the job, your skills, continuing your building your skills outside of normal training hours. But really, the leadership portion, the best leaders I saw in the military and civilian law enforcement, it was people who understood the value of their subordinates and were that buffer between senior management and the workforce. You still have a mission. Senior management gives you a mission that you have to do, but the best leaders understand that it's not just, this is what we're told to do, go out, get it done kind of thing. You have to do this regardless. The best leaders understand the nuances of the people working for them.
That's very true. A lot of times, I know that when I was an officer and I would look at my lower enlisted folks, some of those folks were the most highly skilled at specific things, specific positions. So you have to respect that. And I think that many times in specific branches, especially in war, you have to respect every rank, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
I guess it's the same thing in law enforcement, where whether it's the patrolman or the detective or wherever you stand, there's a really good chance that you're going to end up with a bullet in your back if you treat everyone like shit and you don't have that respect throughout the ranks.
Right.
Would you agree?
Absolutely, I agree. And one of the things I didn't really understand it in the military, but it was something I was exposed to in civilian law enforcement specifically. You're educated. Have you ever heard of the Peter Principle?
No, I haven't.
So the Peter Principle, some psychologist named Peter presented this, and he said it primarily happens in military or paramilitary organizations such as law enforcement, firefighters, or government employees of some kind, or organizations that run on a hierarchy like that, like a contract group. But what he said is you will find that people are promoted to their highest level of incompetence, meaning a lot of people in civilian law enforcement will get promoted to like a sergeant level, right? But then they are incompetent at the sergeant level, so they will get promoted to the lieutenant level because that reduces the amount of people that they actually oversee. Then the more incompetent they are at the lieutenant level, they'll get promoted to captain and so on and so forth, right? Now, does that mean that everybody that's a lieutenant or a captain or that level within a law enforcement organization is incompetent? No, that's not what it's saying. But when you see those bad leaders, that Peter principle generally has been employed, right? So instead of getting rid of the leader at the lowest level and demoting them back from sergeant down and saying, hey, you didn't
Right.
meet the standard at this level, so now we're demoting you back down. Instead of doing that, which you would think would be the most
Right.
productive thing for the workforce, they just continue to promote that individual to a place where then they don't have any influence. And I'm sure you've seen that in the military and in law enforcement, where people get promoted into a position where they have nobody else to really have direct influence on, but they're higher rank. They have that rank or that, role.
And I think it's really important for folks that are like that to know thyself and to humble thyself, because I think sometimes when those folks get pushed upwards because of their incompetence, I think that sometimes they look at that as a positive thing, even though they couldn't handle their last position. But I definitely agree with you on the Peter principle, because I have experienced folks like that as well. In the military, I worked with, majors, lieutenant colonels, and I'm like, really? Like, you don't even know the basics of like what I'm talking about here. How in the heck did you make it to where you're at right now in your rank? And overall, John, so how would you say that your leadership style, how it evolved from your military service to your law enforcement career? How'd that mature?
Well, that's really what it is. It's as you mature, you have to understand, and just what you are saying, know thyself. If you are maturing normally, like anybody, does as they age, if you're able to take a look back and look at yourself and look at how you were in your late teens, early 20s, hopefully you're not the same in your mid 20s to late 20s, right? Hopefully you've matured and developed techniques and evaluated yourself and the way that you approach people. And hopefully that's evolved. So from, being, what I will say though is, just like you said, you can have young enlisted people or new officers in law enforcement who have been on in that job for less than 2 or 3 years, who are phenomenal leaders, right? Just because they haven't been in for a long time or haven't promoted high doesn't mean that they don't have the leadership or leadership capability. So if you are new to law enforcement, you're newer in the military, take those opportunities to exercise the leadership that you see around you. Don't wait for people to tell you to do it. Go out, be the leader that you want to be. And even if it doesn't result in a promotion or a lateral assignment or anything like that, that's what I would recommend. Don't be that person that's only doing it to try and get ahead. Be that person. You can do this from the time you're young, to be that person that is trying to better the organization you're in, specifically to better the organization. So I guess that's where it came. Like, I was doing things when I was younger, trying to get ahead, right? So now, most everything that I do is specifically to try and better either the organization I'm in or the people that I work with, trying to better their financial situation or their position for them. It had nothing to do with me, right? So,
Right. Yeah. You've already paid your dues. You've got your retirement there. And I feel like you're doing your current job now just to simply reach back and help others and educate others. I know we've had long conversations about that.
yeah.
But keeping it on track with law enforcement, military specifically, what do you think are some of today's biggest issues with folks who are young adults, young professionals looking to get into law enforcement or get in even into the military? What do you think? There's so many issues with recruiting, so many issues with just attrition and keeping people in. And what advice do you have for folks out there who might want to align themselves as a good candidate for either one?
Well, so to kind of put it in perspective, I have 6 kids. I have 6 kids. 3 of them have been military, right? And one that's not military is married to military, right? So I am of the mindset that military, law enforcement, or just civil service in general, firefighting, paramedic, anything like that, phenomenal career fields. The current opinion of law enforcement, military, and those things is widely skewed from the reality. And again, unless you get into those fields, you're not going to understand the way it actually is compared to the perception of it in the wider media and sources out there. So if you are interested in those fields, any of those fields, I would highly encourage a younger person that wants to go into the military or into the law enforcement. If they're too young to get into law enforcement, because there is a minimum age requirement for almost every agency I've ever encountered. If you're too young, do yourself the favor of going in the military. The military has the benefits of being in the military far outweigh the negative aspects of being in the military. And you know as well as I do, junior enlisted generally have a much harder time in the military than middle to senior enlisted or officer corps. And that's one of the things I encouraged my kids specifically, and anybody that I've encouraged to go in the military, is don't judge the military based off your first 4-year enlistment. Your first 4-year enlistment is just, it's going to be the hardest part of the military for several aspects. It's a new environment. It's a new lifestyle. You have the lowest rank, right? You have the least responsibility. Everybody that you meet is telling you what you need to do and how to do it and that sort of thing. Well, as you stay in the military, you earn that rank, you earn that responsibility, you perform well at your job, and you start seeing a broader picture of what the military actually is, right? So I would not judge the military based off your first 4 years. Same with law enforcement. Law enforcement is phenomenal, but even still, in the United States, and I think the Western society as large, law enforcement, the average law enforcement career is only 7 years. So, and that's injury, disability, but a large part of that is burnout and people leaving within the first 5 to 7 years of their career because they didn't understand the larger part of what law enforcement actually entails. So, um, you know, like I said, law enforcement, military, both very honorable professions that you are serving a greater purpose than yourself and still being able to provide a decent lifestyle for yourself and your family. So I would highly encourage it.
No doubt. I mean, both of those career paths do require early on, specifically, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears and
Yes.
separation.
Yes.
Whether you join the military, you've got to go to boot camp in some form. You got to go to some form of advanced training, which is not going to be in your backyard. You're going to have to go out and meet folks from all over the United States that are going to have to become your battle buddies. So they may be from Vermont, Montpelier, Vermont, or they may be from the middle of Los Angeles. You don't know. And I think that's also the great thing about the military.
For sure.
And law enforcement, you're going to have to go through some type of academy that's going to be physically and mentally exhausting to some extent. But overall, you're right. I mean, I was talking to a Medal of Honor recipient, and he told me that there's a difference between a job and a career, whereas a career is more soul fulfilling.
Correct.
A job just pays you amount of money. So I think there's something to definitely be said about that. I think you've had a great career, and I'd love to have you on the podcast again to talk more in depth. If anyone out there is interested in following you on any of your social media accounts or checking out your book coming out, how can they do that?
So Instagram, John Benjamin Jones, author. JohnBenjaminJones, author. Facebook and Instagram is just John Benjamin Jones. I'm in the process of developing a website, but once the book is released, it should be available through all Amazon and all online providers. And obviously, once I get the website set up, it'll be available there as well. But the book itself is called A Higher Calling, a Biblical Guide for First Responders, Military, and Veterans. Encourage people to do this hard job of law enforcement and military and still understand that you can do this job and you've been called to a higher purpose doing it. Otherwise, if they have any questions or want to get a hold of me, they can email John Jones, JohnJones at financialguide.com. And, doesn't have to be about, finances or insurance or anything like that, but that's a business email account that they can reach out to me anytime.
Awesome, man. And I'll make sure that I put that all in the notes at the bottom of the YouTube and wherever else this is going to be seen. And I'll update it when your book does come out.
Anybody that's transitioning from the military that is listening to this, I'm sure if they're already listening to you, they're already familiar with the act now. But even if you transitioned out a long time ago, take advantage, go sign up for their intro, their Saturday thing that they got going on, and start taking advantage of this stuff that's available for you. That act now is phenomenal.
Yeah. So you've been on it? You've been checking it out?
I have. Yeah. So my son is actually getting ready to transition out of the Army. So my son was a CB, Navy CB, got out for a year. Not what he thought it was going to be. So he went to go back in the Navy. Wasn't going to work out for him. So he went in the Army. So he's a staff sergeant in the Army right now, and doing kind of doing the same thing. He's utilizing his military time and experience to transition into federal law enforcement. Um, but I've encouraged my son, my daughter. So I have 5 daughters. One of my daughters was a
Good
Navy
Lord.
corpsman, like I was. Encouraged her. Her husband was a Marine. Um, Another one of my daughters is married to a CB. I'm encouraging him. I live close to 2 military bases now. Since I left the California area, I moved to coastal Mississippi, so I'm close to the CB base, and I'm close to an Air Force base. And anytime I'm out, and engaging with people and find out that they were in the military, I'm pushing that stuff. You know,
Awesome. Awesome.
I'm anybody like that. Anybody that was in the military, go out and take advantage of that stuff.
The best distro is by word of mouth,
Yep.
because you personally know people that find those things valuable, and that's the best way. So I appreciate you pushing that onto onto our young military folks as well, and even the veterans out there. And for folks listening, make sure you follow John on Instagram. Check him out on his email as well. Shoot him a message if you want. And then also make sure you follow up with wherever you're watching this, because I'll make sure that in the show notes of the podcast that I update where his book can be found. John, I just want to thank you for giving me your undivided attention today and the opportunity to sit down and have a good conversation with you.
It's always a pleasure talking with you, buddy.
As always, everyone out there listening, make sure you like, subscribe, follow, support on social media. And as always, I want you to stay tuned, stay focused, and stay motivated. Warriors, fall out.